Hello, everyone. It is good to be with you today for our midweek time of study and prayer as part of Wednesday Connect. I'm Claire Sauer. I'm the pastor here at Jones Memorial, and I'm glad to be with you in this time. If you missed our Zoom fellowship meal just a little bit earlier at 5:30, just a reminder that's happening every week. You can get information about how to connect in our weekly messenger and also on email and our Facebook page. And there's several other studies and groups and events that are happening for all ages. So if you've got kids or youth, or you're an older adult and you want to be involved in some different groups, there's opportunities for you every Wednesday, and I hope you will take advantage of those. Just a reminder that even though this is a time of study and prayer, it's not live. And so later in our time together this evening, we will have a time of prayer. And if you want to share some prayer requests, I invite you to type those into the comments so that the folks here can see them and you can know what they are, and we can be in prayer for you and with you as we share those needs and share those burdens with one another. Or if you'd like that to be shared as a part of the video, just make sure you call the church office or email me by kind of like lunchtime on Wednesday, and just let us know what's going on so we can include that in this video and be in prayer for the things that you've got going on in your lives. Some of you who are watching tonight may have heard that permission has been given to United Methodist churches in our area to resume worship inside with an approved plan. So I wanted to talk for just a minute about that, because you're probably wondering what that means for Jones Memorial. We do have an approved plan for indoor worship at Jones, but part of that plan involves essentially launching a whole new worship service. And so I just want you to know that we are moving toward worship inside, but there is a lot of work to be done in preparation for that. And so as we move forward, we'll let you know. We'll let you know soon when worship will be resuming in the building. But in the meantime, I hope that you will take advantage of our outdoor worship opportunities. We will be having a Vesper service on Saturday, October 3rd at 6 p.m. So Saturday, October 3rd at 6 p.m., we'll be gathering in the large side parking lot of the church and worshiping together. And we'll also be sharing communion that night. So I hope you will plan to be a part of that. So this evening, as we come to this time of study, we've been spending a couple weeks now talking about Jesus' meal ministry, and we continue with that, and will be for a few more weeks. And tonight, we're going to look at the feeding of the 5,000, and we're also going to look. Another way to think about this is the feeding of the multitudes. We're going to look at another story of the feeding of the multitudes next week, the feeding of the 4,000. But one thing to know about the feeding of the 5,000 is it appears in all the Gospels, and I'll talk about that more in just a minute. But I'm going to be reading the version from Mark. It's Mark chapter 6, verses 30 to 44. If you're interested and want to do a little bit more study on the feeding of the 5,000, you can find it in Matthew. It's chapter 14, verses 13 to 21. In Luke, it's chapter 9, verses 10 through 17. And in John, it's chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. So let's hear now this story of the feeding of the 5,000 from Mark chapter 6, beginning in verse 30. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him everything they had done and taught. Many people were coming and going, so there was no time to eat. Jesus said to the apostles, "Come by yourselves to a secluded place and rest for a while." They departed in a boat by themselves for a deserted place. Many people saw them leaving and recognized them, so they ran ahead from all the cities and arrived before them. When Jesus arrived and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Then he began to teach them many things. Late in the day, his disciples came to him and said, "This is an isolated place, and it's already late in the day. Send them away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy something to eat for themselves." He replied, "You give them something to eat." But they said to him, Should we go off and buy bread worth almost 8 months' pay and give it to them to eat?" He said to them, "How much bread do you have? Take a look." After checking, they said, "5 loaves of bread and 2 fish." Jesus directed the disciples to seat all the people in groups as though they were having a banquet on the green grass. They sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. He took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, looked up to heaven, blessed them, broke the loaves into pieces, and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. Everyone ate until they were full. They filled 12 baskets with the leftover pieces of bread and fish. About 5,000 had eaten. So as I mentioned, this story of the feeding of the 5,000, it is found in all of the Gospels. But what I think is really important and really kind of cool about this story is that this is the only miracle story that is recorded in all 4 Gospels. And I think it's also important to know that besides being known as the story or the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, it's also known as the miracle of 5 loaves and 2 fish. So I read Mark's version because this is, as best as we know, the first one that was written. So we're pretty sure that both Matthew and Luke drew heavily from Mark when they wrote their Gospels. And so that's why I chose to read the version from Mark's Gospel. Plus, it's a little bit fuller than Matthew and Luke's version. And there's a stronger connection to some other things, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I would encourage you to go look at each of the stories and think about how they're similar and different. So in both Matthew and Mark's Gospel, the feeding of the 5,000 follows right after the beheading of John the Baptist. And in Luke's Gospel, it comes right after the healing of the paralytic by the pool of Bethsaida. And then this extended period of teaching by Jesus. Excuse me, that's in John's Gospel, not Luke's Gospel. In Luke's Gospel, it comes right after John's beheading has been mentioned. So Matthew and Mark immediately follow John's beheading. Luke follows the mention of John's beheading. And then in John, it's right after the healing of the paralytic at the pool of Bethsaida and some period of Jesus teaching. And then he goes and the teaching continues and the feeding of the 5,000 happens. So I think it's important to realize as we move into this story that Jesus has just learned, as best as we can tell, about the violent death of his cousin and his friend. And where this story picks up, we're essentially following Jesus as he is moving and trying to find a place of quiet and a place of solace. And he has this need to grieve the loss of his friend, the loss of John the Baptist. So with that in mind, let's look at what's happening here. So Jesus is trying to find quiet, and he begins to head away from the crowds that are around him. But as crowds see him moving or recognize his disciples leaving, they just follow him. So they're like rowing across the sea, and the crowds are moving along the shore, and when Jesus arrives at this place where he thought he could have some peace and some quiet, the crowds are already waiting for him. So I just wanted you to think about this a minute because, I don't know about you, but when something like that happens to me, when I've lost somebody that I've loved, a friend, or something that's going on in my life, or I've got in my mind something else that I want to do, I just don't put up with other stuff very well. So if I need a break from playing kids games, I just tell Owen I need a break from playing, and he might protest and he might follow me around for a bit trying to convince me to change my mind, but if I need a break, I need a break, and somehow, some way, I usually get that message across to him, and he goes and plays for a little while and I have a break. But that's not what Jesus does. Even though he's grieving, even though he's longing for peace and for quiet, he begins teaching these crowds of people that have come, that have followed him. He doesn't send them away, which I think is kind of our reaction a lot of times when we might be feeling that way. And in fact, the Bible tells us that he had compassion on them. he saw them and he loved them. He had compassion on them. And so that compassion even outweighed the grief um, that Jesus was experiencing. And so they're there. He has compassion upon them, and he begins to teach them, which of course Jesus does so well. But he he then ends up teaching so long that it gets into meal time, and I can almost imagine the disciples getting a little bit restless. Maybe they've heard some of this before, or whatever, and so eventually they come to Jesus and they suggest that he, um, kind of wrap up, get things, finished up, wrapped up, so that the folks can go into town, so that they can go get some dinner. But when the disciples say this to Jesus, Jesus' response is, "You feed them." And I kind of like, just sort of imagine the unsaid words here. Jesus instructing the disciples to care for the physical need of the crowds, the people, and while he continues to take care of their spiritual hunger, their spiritual needs. Um, but the disciples, though, they're kind of stuck in the physical world, because when Jesus says you feed them, they start worrying about, well, okay, where are we going to get that much food? How are we going to pay for it? And they're really pretty aghast, I think, that Jesus would suggest this, and they can't figure out how on earth this is going to work. And so Jesus says, he gives them some instructions. He says, all right, you just go around and gather up what you can, as many loaves as you can find. So they come back. I mean, there's thousands of people here, but they didn't come expecting to have a picnic. They didn't come expecting to eat there. And so all they come up with out of these thousands of people is 5 loaves of bread, 2 fish. And they return to Jesus and they present this to him. And I think probably they present to him also a lot of skepticism. Like, this isn't going to work. You need to wrap it up and send them away so they can get some food. And instead, Jesus gets the crowd settled down. And then in this beautiful moment that foreshadows the Last Supper, he blesses and breaks the bread and then divides the fish. And you all know how it goes from there. The disciples distribute the bread, the fish, the crowds all eat, 5,000 men, and who knows how many women and children. So, I mean, we could be talking, tens of thousands of people. Everyone eats, everyone is satisfied. So then when they're done eating, the disciples go around and they gather up the leftovers, and they return to Jesus with 12 baskets filled with this leftover food. And all of that happened because Jesus didn't turn the people away in the midst of his grief, and instead he had compassion on them. You all are probably familiar with the author Max Lucado. He tells this story of sitting at the red light of a busy intersection one day when he noticed this man that was walking straight toward his car. And so the man had stepped off the curb. He had weaved through several other vehicles, and he started waving at Mr. Lucado. He carried a cardboard sign under his arm, and he had a backpack that was just jammed full on his back. His jeans were baggy, his beard was scraggly, and he kept calling out, "Max, Max, remember me?" Mr. Lucado lowered the car window, and this man, smiled a toothless grin. He said, "I still remember that burger you bought me, Max." And then Mr. Lucado says, "I remember." Months, he recalled, maybe a year earlier, at that exact same intersection, Max had encountered this man and taken him to a nearby, quarter hamburger stand type thing where the two enjoyed a meal together. Got him a burger and they sat down and ate. On that particular day, the man was California bound. And on this day, he tells Mr. Lucado that he's just passing through Texas again. Well, at that point, the light changed and the cars began to honk, and Max Lucado pulled away leaving the man just waving and shouting, "Thanks for the burger, Max. Thanks again." Max reflected, I had long since forgotten that meal, but not him, he said. We never know what one meal will do. When we provide food stamps, we say stave off hunger, but when we invite the hungry to our tables, we address the deeper issues of value and self-worth. We never know what one meal will do. And the feeding of the 5,000 showed that Christ is ready to feed a hungry world. And if we'll avail ourselves to Christ, we'll find that by God's blessing, folks can receive and will receive just what they need, and that there will always be more than enough for everyone. So now we come to the table maybe with some of our burdens and some of the things that weigh heavy on our hearts and our minds, the names of folks who need an encounter with Christ in a particular way right now. And so I'll share these prayer requests with you, and if you have prayer requests that you want to share this evening, please take a minute and type those out and share those so that we can be praying right along with you and include those in this time of prayer as well. Let's remember Taylor Thornton, who's had a knee injury and now is probably going to have some surgery related to that. And also Harriet is facing potential surgery on her neck. Harriet McCrary, want to pray for Harriet as well. Continue to pray for Jane Calvert as she recovers from a fall. Continued prayers for Eric Quinn, that's Danny McDowell's son-in-law, as he recovers from an extensive cancer surgery and they determine the next steps for him. Let's be in prayer for Harold Bradley's dad and also Jared Rowe's dad, Kenny. Prayers for Donna Henson, that's Edna Earl's daughter-in-law. Continued prayers for Danny McCurdy as he recovers from his accident, and for Dwayne and Tina, and also for Carol McDowell, and any additional prayer requests that you may have spoken or unspoken. We want to lift those up now as well. Will you bow with me in a moment of prayer? Loving God, we come to you today as a hungry people, longing to be fed and nourished, perhaps even in ways we don't understand. But you know our need, Lord. You know the words we need to hear. You have made for us a way to connect with God and to experience salvation and life in Him. And we so thank you and praise you for that great and wonderful truth that is everything and will always be everything. And may that always be for us a source of hope. And God, for those who in this time are having difficulty finding reason to hope, we lift them to you. All of these folks that we have named, those whose names have been shared, the people whose names are written on our hearts, and even the people whose names we don't know, God. You know them all. You know their need. And so we come to you seeking healing, seeking comfort, seeking restoration and wholeness and peace. We come to you seeking forgiveness and grace and love and life. And we put our faith in you, God. We trust your will and we trust your way. We thank you and we praise you for the path that you have made for us to experience life in you through Jesus Christ our Lord. It is in his precious and holy name that we pray. Amen. So as I mentioned, next week we will continue with another version of the feeding of the multitudes and talk a little bit about that. That's the feeding of the 4,000. And don't forget that this Sunday we've got worship in the Cyber Sanctuary at 10:30 a.m. You can find that at YouTube and also on Facebook and the church's website. And so I look forward to being in worship with you on Sunday morning. I hope you all have a great week.